Outside the Los Angeles federal courthouse, hundreds of reporters, cameramen, and fans gathered in an atmosphere buzzing with tension and excitement. The crowd pressing against the security barricades, each person eager to witness a historic moment, as legendary actor Morgan Freeman arrived not only as the defendant, but also as his own legal representative. Camera flashes erupted in rapid succession as major news outlets like CNN, BBC, and The Hollywood Reporter broadcasted the case live. On television panels, legal experts debated Freeman's chances of success, many expressing skepticism that an actor, no matter how intelligent or eloquent, could stand against a formidable legal team of Titan Studios. Yet, amid the doubt, a powerful wave of support surged across social media. Fans and industry professionals voiced their backing, believing that Freeman was not only fighting for himself, but for all performers who had been exploited by major studios. Banners reading "Justice for Freeman" and "Protect Artists' Rights" waved high above the sea of people. Some diehard fans even wore t-shirts emblazoned with Freeman's face, turning him into a symbol of resistance against corporate injustice. Meanwhile, reporters speculated on whether Freeman would be able to command the courtroom, some questioning if his signature gravitas could translate into effective legal strategy. All eyes remained fixed on the courthouse steps, waiting for the moment the iconic actor would emerge from his vehicle. As the time approached, anticipation grew heavier, murmurs spread through the crowd, and the world collectively held its breath for the moment when the judge would give the order to commence the trial that could redefine the legal landscape of Hollywood. Judge Beatrix Thornwold sat tall behind the elevated bench of Courtroom 7, her sharp gaze scanning the room as the murmurs of anticipation settled into silence. Her 3 decades on the bench had made her nearly immune to surprise. She had seen everything from tech billionaires to fallen celebrities attempt to manipulate the court. But as Morgan Freeman stood alone at the defense table, no lawyer at his side, a small smirk formed at the corner of her lips. It wasn't out of malice, but rather from the sheer absurdity of what she was witnessing. A legendary actor, an Oscar winner, and one of Hollywood's most respected figures, now attempting to navigate the complex waters of contract law against one of the most well-funded legal teams in the industry. As she adjusted her glasses and glanced at the case file in front of her, she couldn't help but wonder what had possessed Freeman to make such a reckless decision. Did he truly believe his commanding voice and natural storytelling abilities would be enough to sway the court? Or was this simply an act of defiance against the corporate machine? She had presided over entertainment disputes before, had watched actors crumble under cross-examination, their confidence shattered by the relentless precision of corporate attorneys. And she expected no less today. Still, there was something about Freeman's calm demeanor that intrigued her. He did not appear nervous or overwhelmed, but that didn't mean he was prepared, and in her experience, confidence without legal expertise was a recipe for disaster. She tapped her gavel twice, signaling for order, then met Freeman's eyes with a mix of amusement and skepticism. "Mr. Freeman," she said, her tone measured but firm, "my records show that you are representing yourself today, is that correct?" The trial was about to begin, and despite her years of experience, she felt a strange curiosity about what would unfold next. As the heavy oak doors of Courtroom 7 swung open, all eyes turned toward the entrance, and a hush fell over the gallery. Morgan Freeman stepped inside with a measured, deliberate stride, his presence alone commanding the attention of everyone in the room. He was dressed in a tailored charcoal gray suit, simple yet elegant, with a crisp white shirt left unbuttoned at the collar, foregoing a tie. His signature silver hair framed his face, lending him an air of quiet dignity. And as he adjusted his glasses and surveyed the room, his expression remained unreadable. The murmurs that had filled the courtroom moments before now faded into complete silence as members of the press, legal analysts, and spectators observed the unexpected scene before them. Seated in the jury box, the jurors exchanged uncertain glances. Some visibly surprised, others intrigued. They had likely expected to see Freeman flanked by a team of high-profile attorneys, but instead he stood alone, his hands resting calmly at his sides. As he approached the defense table, he did not rush, nor did he falter. Every movement deliberate, exuding the same controlled gravitas that had made his voice one of the most recognizable in the world. From the prosecution side, Titan Studios' lead attorney, a polished man in an expensive Navy suit, studied Freeman with thinly veiled amusement, the kind of condescending look that said he had already won before the trial had even begun. The judge herself observed him with mild curiosity. But the gallery, packed with reporters and Hollywood insiders, seemed torn between admiration and disbelief. This was not a movie. There was no script. And yet, Morgan Freeman carried himself as if he had been preparing for this role his entire life. And whether he was ready for the fight ahead or not, the courtroom belonged to him at that moment. The courtroom settled into a tense silence as Judge Beatrix Thornwald banged her gavel, her voice crisp and authoritative as she announced the commencement of proceedings. "Court is now in session," she declared, her sharp eyes scanning the room before turning toward the prosecution. "Titan Studios, you may proceed with your opening statement." At that, Dominic Reeves, the lead attorney for Titan Studios, adjusted his pristine Navy suit and strode confidently toward the jury, his tone measured but undeniably smug. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his polished voice filling the room, "this case is not complicated. It is about contractual obligations, about honoring agreements, and about a man who, despite his legendary status, is not above the law." He gestured toward Morgan Freeman without even glancing at him. Titan Studios entered into a legally binding contract with Mr. Freeman, securing the full rights to his narration for our upcoming documentary series. But now, after receiving substantial compensation, Mr. Freeman has decided that he wants more, that he no longer wishes to abide by the terms he agreed to. Reeves paced smoothly in front of the jury, pausing for emphasis. "We have the documents, we have the signatures, and we have the undeniable truth. Mr. Freeman is attempting to rewrite history simply because he regrets the deal he made." Murmurs rippled through the gallery as he concluded with a practiced air of finality. "The evidence will speak for itself." He returned to his seat, a satisfied smirk playing on his lips. All eyes then turned to Morgan Freeman, who slowly stood, unruffled, collecting a few sheets of paper from the table in front of him. He took a deep breath before walking toward the jury, his deep, resonant voice filling the room effortlessly. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, pausing just long enough to let the weight of his words settle, "I am not here today because of regret. I am here because of the truth." His voice, so familiar yet so commanding, held the room captive. "Titan Studios does not own my voice, and no contract, no matter how cleverly worded, can change that fundamental fact." He shuffled his papers as if searching for something, letting the silence linger just a moment longer. "But before we discuss contracts, let's talk about something more important. The idea of fairness, of justice, and of the responsibility we all share in protecting the integrity of creative work." The courtroom was motionless, as if everyone had unconsciously held their breath. Reeves watched him with narrowed eyes, sensing for the first time that perhaps this case would not be as easy as he had expected. Judge Thornwald leaned slightly forward in her chair, intrigued despite herself. Morgan Freeman was not a lawyer, but with only a few words, he had already seized control of the courtroom. As the first day of the trial concluded, the scene outside the courthouse was a frenzy of flashing cameras, eager reporters, and animated discussions. News anchors stood in front of their crews relaying the day's most shocking revelation. Not only had Morgan Freeman held his own against Titan Studios' powerful legal team, but he had done so with a quiet confidence that left both the jury and the judge intrigued. Within minutes, headlines flooded television screens and social media platforms. "Morgan Freeman stuns courtroom with powerful opening statement. Hollywood giant faces unexpected challenge," and "Can Freeman win without a lawyer?" Discussions erupted across news networks, with legal analysts debating his chances. Some believed that despite his commanding presence, Freeman was at a severe disadvantage, lacking the formal legal training needed to navigate the complexities of contract law. But others argued that his ability to captivate a room, his deep understanding of fairness, and his measured, strategic delivery could be just as effective as any seasoned attorney. In Hollywood circles, the case had already begun shifting the conversation about artists' rights. Actors and performers voiced their support on social media, calling Freeman's battle an important moment for creatives in the industry. Meanwhile, Titan Studios remained silent, their legal team likely regrouping after witnessing the unexpected composure of the man they had underestimated outside the courthouse. Fans held signs reading "Justice for Freeman" and "A voice cannot be owned." While journalists analyzed every word, every pause, and every subtle shift in Judge Thornwald's expressions, some speculated that she had initially dismissed Freeman as an amateur, but by the end of the day, even she seemed to regard him differently. Whether it was legal brilliance or simply the power of truth, one thing had become clear. This trial was no longer a guaranteed victory for Titan Studios. The original contract between Morgan Freeman and Titan Studios had appeared, at first glance, to be a standard industry agreement, one that outlined his role as the exclusive narrator for their highly anticipated documentary series. It detailed the terms of his compensation, a generous upfront payment along with a percentage of future royalties, ensuring that his voice, which had long been synonymous with wisdom and gravitas, would become the defining element of the project. Freeman, having worked in Hollywood for decades, was no stranger to contracts, and his legal team had reviewed the agreement before he signed, believing it to be fair. However, buried within the dense legal jargon, Titan Studios had subtly inserted an obscure clause under the usage rights section, a clause that, if left unnoticed, granted them perpetual and irrevocable rights to modify, replicate, and distribute the recorded narration in any future medium, format, or derivative work at the time. It had seemed like a standard licensing agreement, but its implications were far more insidious. Essentially, Titan had not just purchased Freeman's narration for this one project, they had secured the right to use his voice indefinitely, even to create new content without his involvement. Worse yet, a separate clause under technological adaptations allowed for the use of AI-generated voice reproduction, meaning Titan Studios could synthesize and manipulate Freeman's voice in the future without requiring his consent. It was a legal maneuver carefully designed to remain unnoticed, but one that, if upheld, would set a dangerous precedent in the entertainment industry. Freeman had only discovered the full scope of the contract's reach months later, when a routine inquiry about royalty payments led his team to a troubling realization. Titan Studios was already testing AI-generated versions of his voice for additional projects, with no plans to compensate him further. It was at that moment that Freeman knew this was no longer just a contractual dispute, it was a fight for the right to own his own voice. Dominic Reeves, the lead attorney for Titan Studios, rose from his seat with practiced ease, buttoning his suit jacket as he walked toward the jury with an air of confidence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth and controlled, "this case is not about deception, nor is it about exploitation. It is simply about honoring a contract." He turned toward the judge, briefly acknowledging her before shifting his attention back to the jury. Morgan Freeman, a respected and seasoned professional in the entertainment industry, willingly signed an agreement with Titan Studios, an agreement that granted our client exclusive rights to his narration for the entirety of this project, and any necessary adaptations. Pausing for effect, he gestured toward a large screen where a highlighted excerpt of the contract appeared. As you can see, the language is clear. Titan Studios retains perpetual and irrevocable rights to the recorded material, including the ability to modify and adapt it as necessary for future distribution. He let the words sink in before continuing. Mr. Freeman, of course, was compensated handsomely for these rights, receiving not only an upfront payment but also a share of future royalties. He was not coerced. He was not misled. He signed with full understanding, and now, after the success of this project, he seeks to retroactively change the terms of that agreement simply because he no longer finds them favorable. Walking closer to the jury, Reeves softened his tone, adopting a more conversational approach. If we allow this kind of dispute to rewrite legally binding contracts, where does it end? Should an actor be able to revoke their performance from a film years after its release? Should a musician reclaim their song simply because they regret a licensing deal? Business cannot function on shifting emotions. Agreements must hold weight, and Titan Studios has done nothing but enforce the very terms that Mr. Freeman agreed to. He turned to the judge, his expression neutral but firm. "We are confident that the law will uphold what is right, that contracts once signed must be respected." Morgan Freeman sat still for a moment before rising from his seat, his movements deliberate, his expression calm but resolute. He walked toward the jury, his deep voice filling the courtroom with an unmistakable sense of authority. "This is not just about a contract," he began, his measured words cutting through the tension in the room. "This is about ownership. Ownership of something that no document should ever be able to take away." He let the silence linger for just a second before continuing. "My voice is more than just a recording. It is an extension of who I am, of my craft, of the years I have spent shaping my career. Yet Titan Studios claims that because of a hidden clause buried deep in the fine print, they now own my voice indefinitely, to use, to manipulate, to recreate. Without my consent, without my involvement, and without any obligation to compensate me fairly." He glanced at the judge, acknowledging her presence before turning back to the jury. "I am not here because I regret signing a deal. I am here because that deal was designed to deceive." The language was deliberately vague, the implications carefully concealed. This was never about a single project. It was about control, about creating a legal precedent where artists, actors, and performers lose their fundamental right to their own voice. He walked back toward his table, pausing as he placed his hands firmly on the surface. "When I first learned the full extent of what Titan Studios had done, I was advised to settle, to let the lawyers handle it. But I knew this fight was bigger than just me, so I studied. I read contract law. I dissected every clause. I spent months preparing because I knew that if I didn't fight back now, one day, no performer would ever have true ownership over their own identity." His gaze locked on to the jury, his voice unwavering. "And that is why I stand before you today, not just as an actor, but as someone defending the right to be more than just a signature on a piece of paper." The financial stakes of this case extended far beyond a simple dispute over contract terms. At its core, this was a battle over intellectual property rights with multi-million-dollar implications. Titan Studios' documentary series, narrated by Morgan Freeman, had already generated massive interest. Early projections estimated that its streaming and distribution rights alone could surpass $500 million in global revenue over the next decade. Yet under the current terms of the contract, Freeman would receive only a fraction of that sum, locked into an agreement that limited his compensation to a one-time upfront payment and a small share of residuals. Worse yet, the clause granting Titan perpetual rights over his narration meant that his voice could be repurposed for sequels, spin-offs, and even AI-generated reproductions, all without any additional payments. Legal analysts estimated that if Titan were to fully exercise these rights, the company could generate hundreds of millions in additional profit, while Freeman, despite being the defining voice of the project, would see no further compensation beyond the immediate financial loss. The case also had profound implications for future negotiations in the entertainment industry. Investors and production studios were watching closely, recognizing that a ruling in favor of Titan could open the door for widespread voice licensing without continued performer consent. Major tech firms, which had begun experimenting with AI-generated voiceovers, were particularly interested in the outcome, seeing an opportunity to push for more aggressive digital replication rights. On the other hand, actors' unions and artist advocacy groups warned that such a precedent could lead to a fundamental shift in entertainment economics, diminishing the long-term earnings of performers. For Freeman, the case was not just about reclaiming what was rightfully his. It was about ensuring that the industry did not normalize a system where a performer's voice, once recorded, could be used forever without fair compensation. Morgan Freeman sat quietly at the defense table, his fingers lightly tapping against the polished wood, his expression calm but his mind restless. This was not just a legal battle, not just a fight over money or contractual obligations. It was a battle over something far more personal: his legacy, his identity, and the fundamental right to control his own voice. For decades, his voice had been a source of comfort, wisdom, and inspiration for audiences around the world. Yet now, Titan Studios was attempting to reduce it to nothing more than a corporate asset, a piece of intellectual property they could manipulate, recreate, and profit from indefinitely, without his consent. That was what unsettled him the most. Not the financial loss, not even the deception in the contract, but the idea that his very essence, the one thing that had defined his career, could be taken from him and used in ways he never intended. He had always believed in fairness, in justice, in the idea that talent and hard work should be respected. Yet here he was, being forced to prove that his voice, something so deeply personal, belonged to him and not to a corporation. The irony was not lost on him. He had narrated countless stories about justice, about heroes standing against impossible odds, and now he found himself in that very position. But unlike a script, there was no predetermined ending. He knew he was up against a system that favored those with power and influence. He knew the legal odds were against him, yet he refused to back down. He had spent a lifetime lending his voice to stories that mattered, and now, for the first time, he realized that this might be the most important story of all: the fight for his own voice, and for the right of every artist to protect their identity. Morgan Freeman had always believed in the power of storytelling, not just as a means of entertainment, but as a way to preserve history, to educate, and to inspire. For years, he had envisioned a documentary that would delve deep into the untold stories of African American history, exploring the resilience, struggles, and triumphs of generations that had shaped the fabric of the United States. This was not just another narration job for him. It was personal. It was a project rooted in his own experiences, in his deep respect for those who had come before him, and in his desire to leave behind something meaningful for future generations. After years of development, countless interviews with historians, and meticulous research, the project finally took shape under the working title, Echoes of the Past. The untold story of Black America, with Freeman not only serving as the narrator, but also playing an integral role in its creative direction. His involvement gave the project an immediate sense of gravitas. His voice, the very same one that had guided audiences through some of the most impactful films and documentaries of all time, became the backbone of the series. It wasn't long before Titan Studios took notice, eager to acquire the rights and position themselves as champions of historically significant content. They approached Freeman with a lucrative offer, promising wide distribution and the resources to elevate the documentary to an even greater scale. At the time, it had seemed like a natural partnership. Freeman, trusting their vision, agreed to the collaboration. What he didn't realize, however, was that Titan's interest went far beyond the documentary itself. They saw something more valuable than just the story. They saw his voice as an asset, to be owned, controlled, and exploited indefinitely. When Titan Studios first approached Morgan Freeman with an offer to collaborate on Echoes of the Past, the untold story of Black America, they framed it as a partnership built on mutual respect and a shared vision. The studio's executives spoke passionately about the importance of the project, emphasizing how Freeman's legendary voice would bring authenticity and gravitas to a documentary that aimed to reshape public understanding of African American history. They assured him that they wanted to do more than just produce another historical series. They wanted to create something timeless, something that would be studied in schools, featured in museums, and serve as a definitive record of the struggles and triumphs of Black Americans. Freeman, whose career had long been defined by his commitment to meaningful storytelling, was drawn to their enthusiasm. During the early meetings, Titan's representatives promised full creative control, telling him that his voice would be treated with the utmost care and respect. They emphasized that this was a project about legacy, something that would outlive all of them and continue educating future generations. They also assured him that the financial terms were generous and fair, offering a substantial upfront payment along with long-term residuals. The studio's legal team presented the contract as standard, emphasizing that it contained nothing unusual beyond what was necessary for distribution. They reassured him repeatedly that he would always be involved in any major decisions regarding his narration, that his voice was his own, and that Titan's role was simply to amplify his message to the world. After several rounds of discussions, Freeman, trusting in their word and in the apparent alignment of their values, signed the deal. He had no idea that buried deep within the contract was a clause that would later become the heart of a battle for control over his voice, a battle he never imagined he would have to fight. When Titan Studios finalized the contract for Echoes of the Past, they ensured that every major clause looked standard, clear terms of payment, distribution rights, and residuals that appeared fair on the surface but hidden deep within the dense legal text, buried under subsections of licensing agreements and distribution logistics. was a clause so carefully worded that even Freeman's legal team initially overlooked it. Disguised under the usage rights section, the clause granted Titan Studios perpetual, irrevocable rights to modify, adapt, and reproduce the recorded narration in any format, including but not limited to technological enhancements, synthetic reproductions, and future applications not yet conceived. At first glance, it seemed like nothing more than standard legal phrasing, something meant to cover minor edits for distribution purposes, but in reality, it was a sweeping claim that gave Titan the ability to use Freeman's voice indefinitely, even generating new content without his direct involvement. Freeman, trusting the integrity of the deal and reassured by the executives who had repeatedly emphasized their respect for his work, signed without second-guessing. His legal team, though thorough, saw nothing immediately alarming. After all, Hollywood contracts were often layered with dense legalese, and Titan's attorneys had framed everything as routine industry practice. It wasn't until months later, when Freeman's business manager conducted a routine review of his royalty statements, that the first red flag appeared. Titan Studios had registered Freeman's narration under synthetic reproduction rights, a term that should never have applied to a live recorded voice performance. Alarmed, his team revisited the contract, scrutinizing each line, and that's when they saw it. The clause they had missed, the loophole that had given Titan the legal grounds to claim ownership of his voice, not just for this project, but for... Morgan Freeman had never been one to scrutinize financial reports in great detail, trusting his management team to handle contractual obligations while he focused on his craft. But when a routine quarterly statement arrived from Titan Studios, something felt off. The numbers didn't add up, and an unexpected classification in the revenue breakdown caught his attention. Synthetic reproduction usage. At first, he assumed it was some kind of clerical mistake, a mislabeling of standard royalty payments. But as he continued reading, he noticed additional references to digital voice replication, terms that had never been discussed during negotiations. His instincts, sharpened by decades in the industry, told him something wasn't right. He forwarded the documents to his legal team, asking them to take a second look at the contract. Within days, they confirmed his worst fears. Titan Studios had quietly inserted a clause that granted them perpetual ownership over his recorded voice, allowing them to modify and reproduce it using artificial intelligence. Freeman was stunned. He had spent a lifetime perfecting his voice, shaping it into the signature tone that audiences around the world recognized, and now, without his consent, it had been reduced to an asset, something that could be manipulated, edited, and even recreated without him. The betrayal felt deeply personal. He had trusted Titan Studios when they promised creative respect and ethical partnership, yet here they were, treating his voice as something they could own outright. His first instinct was to demand an immediate correction, to believe that this could be resolved with a few stern conversations. But when Titan's executives dismissed his concerns, insisting that everything was in the contract, Freeman realized this was no mistake. It was a calculated move, and the only way to stop it was to fight back. Morgan Freeman had spent his life mastering the art of storytelling. His voice had guided audiences through history, science, and human triumph. Yet now, he found himself in a story he never expected, a battle over the very right to control his own voice. When his legal team confirmed that Titan Studios had legally maneuvered their way into owning and replicating his narration, the first instinct was to fight fire with fire, to hire the most elite entertainment lawyers money could buy. But something about that approach didn't sit right with him. He had seen too many cases where justice got buried under legal formalities, where truth was lost in a sea of legal jargon and technicalities. If this fight was about more than just a contract, if it was about principles, about setting a precedent, then he needed to stand in that courtroom himself, not as a client hiding behind a team of lawyers, but as the man whose voice they were trying to take. So he made a decision, one that stunned his advisors. He would represent himself. His team protested, arguing that contract law was far too complex, that he was walking into a fight against some of the best corporate attorneys in the industry. But Freeman had already made up his mind. He spent months immersing himself in legal texts, studying intellectual property laws, dissecting past court cases involving voice rights. He consulted legal scholars, not to hire them, but to learn from them. He read every line of his contract, breaking it down until he understood its weaknesses. He knew he couldn't outmaneuver Titan's lawyers in technical expertise, but what he could do was something they weren't expecting: speak with the authority of someone who had everything at stake. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for every artist who had ever been told they didn't own their own creation, and if he was going to win, he would do it on his own terms. Morgan Freeman had expected deception, but when his team uncovered internal emails from Titan Studios, the sheer audacity of their scheme left him momentarily speechless. Buried within a trove of corporate correspondence, hidden behind legal discussions and financial reports, were emails that revealed the truth in brutal clarity. "Freeman doesn't even know what he signed," one executive wrote. "Once the series launches, we can begin integrating the synthetic replication tech without issue." Another email, dated just weeks after Freeman had completed his narration, outlined a plan to gradually phase out real voice work in favor of AI-generated audio. "His voice is an asset, not a partnership," one legal advisor noted. "If we control the recordings, we control the product. He can't revoke what's already ours." As Freeman read through the exchanges, his jaw tightened. Each message was worse than the last. Not only had Titan deliberately structured the contract to strip him of ownership, but they had always intended to replace him. The emails spoke of test trials, of machine learning models trained on his narration, of an entire digital library that could, within months, make his actual participation obsolete. What angered him most was the arrogance, the absolute certainty that he would never notice, never question, never fight back. His hands clenched as he scrolled through the damning evidence. He had built his career on trust, on the belief that integrity still mattered in an industry driven by money. But Titan Studios had viewed him as nothing more than intellectual property to be acquired and exploited. Freeman knew what these emails meant. They were not just proof of corporate greed, they were his greatest weapon. With these messages, Titan's entire defense crumbled. They could no longer claim this was just a contractual misunderstanding. They had planned this from the start, and now the world would see them for what they truly were. As the courtroom projector flickered to life, the room fell into an uneasy silence. Morgan Freeman, standing at the defense table, pressed play on a newly submitted piece of evidence, a secret recording of an internal Titan Studios meeting. The audio crackled for a moment before clearing, and then unmistakable voices filled the courtroom. "The beauty of this deal is that Freeman won't even realize what's happening until it's too late," one executive said, his tone laced with confidence. "We own the recordings, we own the rights, and once the AI model is finalized, we won't need him anymore." A murmur spread through the gallery as the recording continued. Another voice, presumably one of Titan's legal advisors, spoke up. "What if he contests it? What if he realizes we're using his voice for future projects without his approval?" A pause, then laughter, followed by the voice of Titan's CEO. "It doesn't matter. The contract is airtight. We have the rights to technological adaptations. He signed it, and he can't take it back." The words hung in the air like a confession. The prosecution's lead attorney, Dominic Reeves, stiffened at the plaintiff's table, his jaw clenched, his fingers gripping his pen so tightly that his knuckles whitened. Judge Thornwall leaned forward, her sharp gaze cutting through the tension. "Mr. Reeves," she said, her voice dangerously calm, "would you care to explain why your clients were openly discussing a scheme to cut Mr. Freeman out of his own work?" Reeves cleared his throat, flipping through his notes as if searching for a lifeline. "Your Honor, this recording is taken out of context," he stammered. "Discussions of internal strategy do not constitute wrongdoing," but the damage was already done. The jury watched in stunned silence, and, for the first time since the trial began, the ironclad arrogance of Titan Studios cracked. They had not just attempted to manipulate a contract, they had conspired to erase Freeman's voice while continuing to profit from it. And now, caught in their own words, there was no way to deny it. The air in the courtroom grew tense as the defense table stirred. Morgan Freeman stood calmly, his hands resting on the table, but there was something in his expression. A quiet knowing, as if he had been waiting for this moment. "Your Honor," he said, his deep voice carrying an undeniable weight, "the defense would like to call a new witness." Judge Beatrix Thornwald arched an eyebrow, not expecting any additional names on the list. "Proceed, Mr. Freeman." she said, glancing toward the doors as they opened with a slow creak. The gallery murmured in surprise as a man in an expensive but slightly rumpled suit stepped forward, his face familiar to many in the entertainment industry, Dominic Reeves. The lead attorney for Titan Studios visibly tensed, his jaw tightening as he exchanged a sharp look with his clients. "Objection," Reeves said quickly, standing with a practiced ease. "This witness was not disclosed in advance. This is—" But Judge Thornwald raised a hand, silencing him. "Let's hear who he is first," she said, her gaze shifting toward the man now approaching the witness stand. "Please state your name for the court." The man hesitated for a moment, his fingers gripping the edge of the stand before he finally spoke. "Jonathan Marks," he said, his voice steady but low, "former Chief Operations Officer at Titan Studios." The reaction was immediate. Whispers spread through the room, cameras clicked, and even the jury sat forward. Reeves' confidence cracked for the first time as he turned toward his clients, his expression darkening. Titan's executives sat frozen, their faces paling as the reality of the situation sank in. Marks cleared his throat, looking toward Freeman with a nod before turning back to the judge. "I'm here to tell the truth," he said, his voice stronger now, "about what Titan Studios did, about how they planned to steal Mr. Freeman's voice, and about how they knew from the very beginning that this was never just about a documentary." Silence gripped the courtroom, and for the first time, it was Titan Studios, not Freeman, who looked like they were fighting a losing battle. The revelation of Jonathan Marks' testimony, combined with the leaked internal emails and the secret recordings, sent shockwaves through the courtroom and beyond. Legally, Titan Studios was no longer just facing a contract dispute. It was now entangled in accusations of fraud, corporate deception, and potential violations of intellectual property law. Judge Beatrix Thornwald, who had initially viewed this case as a routine contractual disagreement, now regarded the plaintiffs with a visibly hardened expression. She turned to Titan's legal team, her tone sharp. "Mr. Reeves, given the evidence presented, are you prepared to explain why your clients engaged in deliberate misrepresentation and possible fraud?" Reeves, usually poised and composed, now looked flustered, flipping through his notes as if searching for a way out. But there was none. Outside the courthouse, the media had already seized on the developments. Headlines exploded across news networks and social media. Titan Studios exposed, the plot to own Freeman's voice. Hollywood's biggest legal scandal unfolds. And is this the end for Titan? The public reaction was swift and furious. Actors, musicians, and content creators flooded online platforms with messages of support for Freeman, while industry insiders warned that this case could set a dangerous precedent for AI-generated voice reproduction and corporate overreach. Financial analysts speculated that Titan Studios, once considered a media powerhouse, could face severe consequences beyond the courtroom. Not only were they at risk of losing millions in damages, but their reputation was in freefall. Streaming platforms and distributors quietly began reconsidering their partnerships. Stockholders panicked as shares plummeted. Even before the final ruling, one thing had become clear. The legal and public backlash against Titan Studios had already begun, and there would be no easy way for them to recover. The tension at Titan Studios' legal table was palpable. Dominic Reeves, once exuding the confidence of a man with an easy victory ahead, now gripped his pen so tightly his knuckles turned white. His team of corporate attorneys, usually composed and methodical, exchanged hurried whispers, flipping through legal documents that now seemed useless in the face of the overwhelming evidence piling up against them. The secret emails, the damning audio recordings, and the shocking testimony of Jonathan Marks had completely unraveled their strategy. They had entered this trial believing they were defending an ironclad contract, but now they were scrambling to salvage their client from a full-scale corporate scandal. Reeves stood abruptly, clearing his throat as he forced a smile. "Your Honor, the defense's so-called evidence is circumstantial at best," he said, his voice carrying a faint tremor. "Corporate strategy discussions do not equate to wrongdoing. Businesses plan for contingencies all the time." But Judge Thornwald, unimpressed, leaned forward. "Are you suggesting that premeditated efforts to erase an artist's rights and profit off their voice indefinitely is a contingency?" Reeves hesitated. "I am saying that," but before he could finish, Freeman calmly interjected, You're saying Titan Studios made a business decision, not an ethical one. His words cut through the courtroom, heavy with meaning. Reeves quickly pivoted. Your Honor, even if Titan Studios discussed potential AI replication, there is no conclusive proof they intended to act upon it. But Freeman, his hands folded, simply nodded toward the courtroom screen, where Titan's own emails and meeting transcripts were still displayed. Then why, he asked, his deep voice steady, did they already begin testing my AI-generated voice? A ripple of gasps spread through the gallery. Reeves turned back toward his clients, but the looks on their faces said it all. They were out of options, out of defenses, and dangerously close to losing everything. Morgan Freeman had always believed that knowledge was the greatest weapon, so when he realized Titan Studios had manipulated his contract to claim ownership of his voice, he did not react with anger. He reacted with determination. Rather than relying solely on a legal team, he immersed himself in the very laws that governed the entertainment industry. Night after night, he pored over intellectual property statutes, performance rights agreements, and case precedents that had shaped Hollywood's legal landscape. He studied the technological adaptation clause, the very loophole Titan had exploited. But what he found in return was a hidden safeguard. A rarely invoked provision in the Performers' Rights Protection Act, a law designed to prevent studios from misusing an actor's likeness or voice beyond the intended scope of a project. The key was intent. And thanks to the leaked Titan Studios emails and audio recordings, he now had undeniable proof that their plan had always been to phase him out and replace him with an AI-generated version of his voice. Armed with this knowledge, Freeman walked into court not just as an actor defending his career, but as a man who understood exactly how to dismantle the opposition's case. When Titan's lawyers insisted that the contract gave them full rights to his recordings, Freeman countered by citing Section 42B of the Performers' Rights Act, which explicitly stated that a studio could not repurpose an actor's performance if the adaptation significantly altered the nature of their contribution without additional consent. Standing before the jury, Freeman's voice was steady, resonant, undeniable. Titan Studios believed that because I am not a lawyer, I would not understand my own rights, he said, his eyes scanning the room. But I do. At that moment, it became clear to everyone in the courtroom he had turned their own contract against them, and Titan Studios was no longer in control of the narrative. The courtroom was silent as Morgan Freeman calmly approached the judge's bench. A thick legal document in his hands, he adjusted his glasses and looked directly at Judge Beatrix Thornwald, his voice steady, measured, and filled with quiet authority. Your Honor, I would like to draw the court's attention to Section 47B of the Intellectual Property Rights Act of 1998. The mention of the statute sent a ripple of confusion through the courtroom. Even Titan Studios' legal team seemed momentarily thrown off. Dominic Reeves frowned, quickly flipping through his notes. This was not a provision they had prepared to argue against. Judge Thornwald, intrigued, leaned forward. I'm familiar with most intellectual property protections, Mr. Freeman, but that section is rarely cited. Please elaborate. Freeman turned toward the jury, his presence commanding the room. Section 47B, he explained, was designed to prevent corporations from claiming ownership over an artist's irreplaceable performance assets, meaning that no matter what a contract states, if the intent of the agreement results in the studio gaining exclusive control over an actor's voice or likeness in perpetuity, that contract becomes unenforceable. A hushed murmur spread through the gallery as legal analysts in attendance quickly began searching for the clause on their devices. Freeman continued, his gaze unwavering. Titan Studios did not simply license my voice for a single project. They structured a deal that, in effect, removed my ability to ever reclaim my own voice. They did not purchase a narration. They attempted to purchase me. The weight of his words settled over the room like a hammer. Judge Thornwald took the legal document from Freeman, reading through it carefully. For the first time since the trial began, she looked up at Titan's attorneys, her expression unreadable. Mr. Reeves, she said, her voice carrying a new, deliberate weight. Do you have a counter-argument, or was your team unaware of this law? Reeves hesitated, his usual confidence visibly shaken. He had spent years mastering corporate contract law. But this statute, this one obscure protection buried in decades-old Hollywood legislation, had caught them completely off guard, and in that moment, the balance of power in the courtroom shifted. Judge Beatrix Thornwald had entered this trial with a quiet skepticism. She had seen celebrities attempt to outmaneuver the legal system before, their confidence often outweighing their actual understanding of the law. And when Morgan Freeman had declared that he would represent himself, she had assumed he was making a mistake, one born from pride rather than strategy. But now, as she sat behind the bench, her fingers resting thoughtfully against the worn pages of the legal document he had just presented, she realized how deeply she had underestimated him. Freeman was not simply defending himself. He had orchestrated this case with precision. From the moment he cited Section 47B of the Intellectual Property Rights Act, she had watched the attorneys for Titan Studios fumble, blindsided by a law they had assumed was too obscure to be relevant. This was no accident. He had planned this. He had studied their arguments, dissected their contract, and found the one legal safeguard they had overlooked. Looking up from the document, she studied Freeman, who now stood at his table, calm and composed. His demeanor was nothing like the usual self-presenting defendant. He was not arrogant, nor did he posture for the jury. He simply knew exactly what he was doing. Thornwald tapped her gavel lightly, gathering the courtroom's attention, then turned to Titan's lead counsel, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Reeves, given Mr. Freeman's citation of this statute, I assume you have a prepared counter-argument." The slight edge in her voice was unmistakable. A challenge, but Reeves hesitated, flipping through his notes, searching for something that clearly wasn't there. Thornwald exhaled slowly, turning back to Freeman, and for the first time she allowed the hint of a knowing smile to touch her lips. "Mr. Freeman," she said, "I misjudged you." She wasn't speaking as a judge anymore, but as someone recognizing a brilliant strategist sitting before her. Dominic Reeves, now visibly rattled, stood quickly, forcing a confident posture as he turned to address the court. "Your Honor," he began, his voice carrying a carefully measured authority, "while Mr. Freeman's argument is certainly compelling, Section 47B is not applicable in this case. The contract signed by Mr. Freeman was negotiated under industry-standard terms, and there is no evidence that Titan Studios acted outside the bounds of legal precedent." He walked toward the jury, regaining some of his composure. "What Mr. Freeman is asking for," he continued, "is a reinterpretation of a contract he willingly signed. He is not a victim of deception. He is an artist experiencing regret, and he seeks to retroactively alter a deal that was fair at the time of signing." Reeves turned slightly, facing Freeman now, as if challenging him directly. "Hollywood has operated this way for decades. Actors, musicians, and voice artists routinely license their work for use beyond the original project. If we allow Mr. Freeman to set a precedent that contracts can be dismissed based on perceived injustice rather than legal merit, we risk destabilizing an entire industry." There was a pause, a moment where it seemed Titan Studios might have clawed back control, but then Freeman stood, adjusting his suit with the same quiet confidence he had carried throughout the trial. "Mr. Reeves," he said, his deep voice resonating through the courtroom, "you claim my contract is industry standard. But what happens when an industry standard is built on exploitation?" He turned toward Judge Thornwald. "Your Honor, Titan Studios argues that I signed away my rights knowingly, but the evidence proves otherwise." He reached for a document, handing it to the clerk. "This is an internal Titan Studios memo, one that explicitly states their intent to bury the AI replication clause deep enough that I wouldn't notice. And that, Your Honor, is not a fair contract. It's a deception." The jury leaned forward. Judge Thornwald took the document, scanning its contents, then slowly lifted her gaze toward Reeves. "Mr. Reeves, do you care to explain this?" Titan's attorney hesitated, his silence louder than any argument he could make, and in that moment it became clear. Freeman had dismantled them piece by piece, and there was no recovering from it. Morgan Freeman stood tall at the defense table, his presence unwavering even as the full weight of Titan Studios' legal machine bore down on him. The opposing attorneys had thrown every argument they could muster, their polished rhetoric filled with industry jargon and legal technicalities meant to overwhelm and confuse. But Freeman remained unshaken, his calm gaze moving from the jury to Judge Beatrix Thornwald before he spoke. "Pressure does not change the truth." His voice, rich and steady, resonated through the courtroom. "It only reveals it." He walked toward the jury box, his movements deliberate, measured, not hurried like those of a man struggling to regain control, but of someone who had never lost it to begin with. Titan Studios has spent this trial arguing that this is about business, about contracts, about deals made and honored, but let's strip all of that away for a moment and ask a simpler question. Can a person's voice truly be owned by someone else? He let the words settle. The jury shifting slightly as they considered his question, he turned to the judge. Your Honor, I have read every law they have cited. I have listened to every argument they have made, and what I have found is simple. Nowhere in any legal statute does it say that a human voice, a fundamental part of a person's identity, can be permanently signed away as if it were a piece of real estate. The courtroom was utterly silent. Freeman's voice, with all its natural authority, filled the space. Titan Studios want you to believe that what they did was legal, but legality without ethics is just manipulation with paperwork. Judge Thornwald studied him carefully, the hint of respect in her eyes now undeniable. The jury, once uncertain, now seemed engaged, drawn in not just by his words but by the sheer presence of a man who, against all odds, refused to be intimidated. Freeman had done more than defend himself. He had turned logic into conviction and conviction into truth. As the trial neared its climax, the air in the courtroom was thick with anticipation. Judge Beatrix Thornwald turned to Titan Studios' lead attorney, Dominic Reeves, giving him the floor for his closing argument. Reeves adjusted his tie, taking a steadying breath before stepping toward the jury, his voice smooth, deliberate, carefully calculated to regain control of the narrative. Ladies and gentlemen, we live in a world governed by contracts, he began, his polished tone carrying an air of finality. If we start allowing agreements to be overturned based on emotional appeal rather than legal merit, then we risk unraveling the foundation upon which business and commerce stand. Mr. Freeman willingly signed this contract. He accepted compensation. He engaged in a legally binding agreement. What he is doing today is not seeking justice, he is seeking an exception. And the law does not bend for exceptions. Reeves let his words hang for effect before turning back to his seat, Titan's executives sitting stiffly behind him. Their expressions unreadable. The jury remained motionless, their eyes shifting toward Freeman as he slowly stood, adjusting his suit, his hands resting lightly on the table as he took a breath. Mr. Reeves speaks of the law as if it were something fixed, something unyielding, something that cannot evolve. His deep voice resonated, steady, unwavering. But the very purpose of the law is to protect what is just, to evolve when exploitation is revealed. If the law did not change, we would still live in a world where artists had no rights, where corporations could do as they pleased. Unchecked, he walked toward the jury, his pace unhurried, his presence commanding. Titan Studios says this contract was fair, but fairness cannot exist where deception thrives. They did not just purchase my voice for a project, they attempted to own it forever. They claim this is standard business. I ask you, is that the kind of business we should accept? A hush fell over the room, the jury held captive by his words. Judge Thornwald studied him intently, and for the first time, Titan Studios had nothing left to say. The battle was over, and everyone in the room knew it. The courtroom fell into a tense silence as Judge Beatrix Thornwald adjusted her glasses, her gaze sweeping across the room. Before settling on the documents before her, the weight of the case was evident in the way she exhaled slowly, the murmurs from the gallery fading as she lifted her gavel. Morgan Freeman sat motionless at the defense table, his hands folded neatly, his face unreadable. Yet beneath the calm exterior, a storm of anticipation brewed. This moment would define not just his case, but the future of performer rights. Across the room, Titan Studios executives sat rigid. Their lead attorney, Dominic Reeves, clenched his jaw, his fingers gripping the edge of the table as if bracing for impact. Judge Thornwald looked up, her voice firm. After careful review of the evidence, testimony, and legal arguments presented, this court finds in favor of the defendant, Mr. Freeman. A collective gasp rippled through the room, followed by an eruption of whispers. Cameras clicked, the press scrambling to capture the moment. But Freeman remained still, closing his eyes briefly, allowing the reality of his victory to settle over him. Judge Thornwald wasn't finished. Furthermore, the court finds that Titan Studios engaged in deceptive contractual practices in an attempt to claim perpetual ownership of Mr. Freeman's voice. The contract's AI replication clause is hereby deemed unenforceable, and all rights to Mr. Freeman's voice and likeness are immediately and fully restored to him. Titan's legal team visibly deflated. Reeves' mouth opened as if to argue, but no words came. The jury watched with quiet satisfaction, as if knowing they had played a part in something larger than a mere contract dispute. Outside the courthouse, crowds erupted in celebration, actors, artists, and creatives across the industry recognizing this victory as a precedent that would forever change how performers' rights were protected. As Judge Thornwald banged her gavel one final time, her eyes briefly met Freeman's, and for the first time, there was no skepticism, only respect. Justice had been served. The moment Judge Beatrix Thornwald's gavel struck the bench, the news exploded beyond the courtroom walls. Headlines flashed across television screens and news websites within minutes. Morgan Freeman wins landmark case against Titan Studios. Hollywood power shift. Performers reclaim their rights. And Titan Studios faces industry backlash after courtroom defeat. Outside the courthouse, a massive crowd of supporters erupted into cheers, their banners and signs declaring victory for not just Freeman, but for every artist who had ever fought against corporate overreach. Social media became a firestorm of reactions. Actors, musicians, and voice performers flooded platforms like Twitter and Instagram with messages of support, many calling it a turning point in entertainment law. Major actors who had long remained silent on contract disputes now spoke out, sharing their own experiences with exploitative deals. For Hollywood, this was more than just a legal battle, it was a cultural shift. Inside Titan Studios, the fallout was immediate and catastrophic. Their stock plummeted within hours, investors panicked, and production partners distanced themselves from the disgraced company. Major streaming platforms quietly began reconsidering their contracts with Titan. While their board of directors scrambled to contain the damage, within days several top executives resigned, including the very CEO who had orchestrated the scheme against Freeman. Industry insiders speculated that Titan Studios, once a dominant force in Hollywood, might never recover from the scandal. Meanwhile, Freeman, despite the overwhelming media frenzy, remained humble in victory. When reporters swarmed him outside the courthouse, demanding a statement, he simply smiled and said, "This was never just about me. This was about fairness, about ensuring that no artist is ever reduced to a contract clause again." With those words, he walked away, not just as a Hollywood legend, but as a man who had rewritten the rules of the industry forever. In the weeks following Morgan Freeman's decisive legal victory, the entertainment industry underwent a seismic shift. The case, once viewed as a contractual dispute between an actor and a studio, had now set a powerful legal precedent that could not be ignored. Legal analysts dissected the ruling, noting that Judge Beatrix Thornwald's decision had established a new benchmark for performer rights, effectively dismantling the long-standing assumption that studios could claim perpetual control over an artist's voice or likeness under the guise of contractual fine print. Almost immediately, entertainment unions, including the Screen Actors Guild, SAG-AFTRA, began drafting new protections for performers, ensuring that no studio could exploit a voice or image without renewed consent. Major Hollywood agencies, seeing the public outrage against Titan Studios, pushed for revisions in standard industry contracts, removing ambiguous clauses that once allowed companies to silently acquire permanent control over recorded performances. The ruling also sent shockwaves through the emerging AI and digital replication sectors. Technology firms that had been quietly developing AI-generated voice models were now forced to reconsider their ethical boundaries. Legal teams across Hollywood scrambled to assess which existing contracts might now be challengeable under the new precedent. Several high-profile actors who had previously resigned themselves to unfavorable licensing deals suddenly had the leverage to renegotiate. Meanwhile, major studios, fearing public backlash and legal consequences, announced sweeping changes to their contractual policies, distancing themselves from Titan Studios' failed strategy. What had begun as one actor's fight against a deceptive clause had now evolved into a defining moment in Hollywood's legal evolution. The Freeman ruling was no longer just about a single case. It had reshaped the entertainment industry's understanding of intellectual property, fairness, and the fundamental rights of performers for generations to come. The courtroom, typically a space of rigid decorum and measured silence, held its breath as Judge Beatrix Thornwald delivered the final ruling in favor of Morgan Freeman. For a moment, the weight of the decision seemed to linger in the air, the reality of what had just transpired sinking into the minds of everyone present. And then it happened. A sound rarely heard in the solemn halls of justice, a ripple of applause hesitant at first but quickly growing into a thunderous ovation. The jury, who had remained composed throughout the trial, exchanged glances before joining in, several members nodding in quiet admiration. In the gallery, actors, artists, and industry professionals, many of whom had come to witness history, rose to their feet, clapping with genuine, unrestrained enthusiasm. Even some legal observers, hardened by years of courtroom battles, could not deny that they had just witnessed something extraordinary. Judge Thornwald, though maintaining her professional stance, allowed a small, rare smile to cross her lips as she tapped her gavel lightly, signaling for the room to settle, but the applause did not die down immediately. Instead, it swelled as Morgan Freeman slowly stood, not to bask in the celebration, but to acknowledge the moment. He did not gloat, nor did he revel in Titan Studios' defeat. Instead, he turned toward the jury and gave a single appreciative nod, as if to say, "This victory belongs to more than just me." Titan Studios' legal team sat stiffly, defeated, while the studio's executives averted their eyes, knowing they had not just lost a case but a battle for the soul of the industry. And yet Freeman, standing in the center of it all, remained the same, steady, dignified, unshaken. As the applause finally faded, he exhaled slowly, knowing that this moment, this fight, would be remembered far beyond the walls of that courtroom. Judge Beatrix Thornwald had presided over countless high-profile cases in her 3 decades on the bench. She had seen celebrities attempt to outmaneuver the legal system with charm, arrogance, or sheer stubbornness, and it rarely ended well for them. So when Morgan Freeman walked into her courtroom, standing alone at the defense table, without a high-power attorney at his side, she barely concealed her skepticism. In her experience, actors often mistook their ability to captivate an audience for the ability to argue the law, but the two were not the same. When Freeman confidently declared that he would be representing himself, Thornwald's first reaction was not admiration, it was doubt. She glanced at the contract in question, then at the team of corporate attorneys seated across from him. Titan Studios had come armed with some of the most ruthless legal minds in the business, seasoned litigators who spent their careers exploiting contractual loopholes. Thornwald knew that entertainment law was notoriously complex, filled with layers of intellectual property statutes, licensing clauses, and technological adaptation provisions that could take even experienced attorneys years to master. How could Freeman, a man known for his voice, not his legal acumen, possibly hope to hold his ground against them? She leaned forward slightly, studying him, searching for any sign that he understood the gravity of what he was up against. His expression was calm, steady, but was it confidence or just the misplaced assurance of a man who didn't realize he was walking into a disaster? "Mr. Freeman," she said, her tone measured but firm, "you do understand that contract law is highly technical and that failure to present your case properly could result in an unfavorable ruling." If she expected him to falter, to hesitate, she was mistaken. He simply met her gaze and nodded. "I understand, Your Honor." She sighed inwardly, filing this case away in her mind as yet another example of a performer who didn't know when to let the professionals handle it. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that Freeman had come prepared for more than just a performance. He had come to win. Long before she sat behind the bench, before the black robes and the sharp gavel strikes, Beatrix Thornwald had been a young, ambitious woman with dreams far removed from the courtroom. Fresh out of MIT with a degree in engineering and media technology, she had secured an internship at Vertex Studios, a powerhouse in early digital film production. It was an exciting time. Hollywood was on the verge of a technological revolution, and she had been determined to be part of it. She worked tirelessly, spending long nights developing a groundbreaking audio compression algorithm that could enhance film soundtracks while preserving the richness of original recordings. Her supervisor praised her innovation. The studio executives called it the future of digital sound editing. She was naive enough to believe that meant something then. One morning, she arrived at work to find her access revoked, her project reassigned, and her name missing from the patent application. When she confronted her supervisor, he barely looked up from his desk. "That's just how the industry works," he had said. "If you want to get ahead, learn to let things go." But Thornwald couldn't let it go. She spent weeks fighting for recognition, for justice. But Vertex had the money, the lawyers, the influence. She had nothing. Eventually, she walked away, disillusioned but not defeated. That moment changed her. She abandoned her plans to work in entertainment technology and instead enrolled in law school, determined to fight for those who, like her, had been dismissed, overlooked, and taken advantage of by an industry that thrived on control. And now, decades later, sitting in a courtroom where yet another Hollywood giant had tried to manipulate a contract to strip an artist of his rights, she saw herself in Morgan Freeman, not as the famous actor, but as the man fighting against a system that believed he was powerless. And suddenly, this case was no longer just about contract law, it was personal. As the courtroom emptied and the noise of the media frenzy faded into the halls, Judge Beatrix Thornwald remained seated at her bench, watching as Morgan Freeman gathered his papers with the same calm composure he had carried throughout the trial. She had spent years delivering rulings with detached professionalism, ensuring that justice was served without personal bias, but today was different. Today, she had misjudged a man who had done what few could. Walk into a courtroom alone and outmaneuver an entire legal empire. She stood, stepping down from the bench just as Freeman turned to leave. "Mr. Freeman," she called, her voice softer than it had been in court. He paused, turning to face her with quiet curiosity. "Would you walk with me for a moment?" He nodded, following her into a side chamber, away from the eyes of the press. For a long moment, she simply looked at him, as if reassessing the very man she had doubted. Then she sighed, a small, self-deprecating smile tugging at her lips. "I owe you an apology," she admitted. "When you first walked into my courtroom without an attorney, I assumed you were making a mistake. I thought you were another performer who believed charm and conviction could replace the law." Freeman tilted his head slightly, listening, saying nothing. "I was wrong," Thornwald continued. "You didn't just understand the law, you mastered it. You built a legal strategy so meticulous that you left a team of corporate attorneys scrambling for footing. And that, Mr. Freeman, is something I did not expect." She exhaled, her gaze unwavering. "I've spent my career protecting people like you from contracts designed to control them, but today, you didn't need my protection. You proved that you could fight for yourself, and you won, not because you're famous, not because you're admired, but because you were right." Freeman studied her for a moment, then gave a slow nod, a hint of gratitude in his eyes. "Justice isn't about who speaks the loudest," he finally said. "It's about who tells the truth." Thornwald smiled, offering her hand. "And today, Mr. Freeman, you told it better than anyone ever has." Morgan Freeman studied Judge Beatrix Thornwald for a moment, taking in the sincerity of her words. Her apology was not a mere formality, not the carefully measured diplomacy of a judge maintaining her authority. It was genuine, and he respected that. He had faced doubt his entire career, from those who believed a man like him could never rise beyond the roles Hollywood had carved out, to those who thought wisdom and intelligence were separate from artistry. Thornwald had been no different when this trial began, seeing him as just another actor overestimating himself. But now, standing before him, she was a judge who had not only acknowledged her mistake, but had allowed herself to learn from it. That, more than any verdict, was proof that justice was more than just rulings. It was about growth, about recognizing when the system itself had failed and having the courage to change it. Freeman nodded, his deep voice steady yet thoughtful. "I appreciate that, Your Honor. But this was never about me proving something to you or to them." He gestured vaguely toward the now empty courtroom. "This was about proving something to the industry, to the system that allowed this to happen in the first place." He exhaled, his gaze steady. "Winning this case doesn't matter. If the next performer walks into a room and signs away their identity without knowing it, justice isn't about a single victory. It's about making sure no one has to fight this battle again." Thornwald nodded slowly, the weight of his words settling over her. She had spent her career upholding the law, but Freeman had done something different. He had forced the law to confront its own shortcomings and demand change. She extended her hand again, This time, not just as a gesture of respect, but as a silent acknowledgement that the system itself had needed this lesson just as much as she had. Freeman clasped her hand firmly, then with a small, knowing smile turned and walked away, leaving behind more than just a courtroom. He left behind a legacy. As the courthouse emptied and the echoes of the trial faded, Judge Beatrix Thornwald remained seated at her bench, staring at the worn wooden surface that had been the foundation of her career for over 30 years. She had devoted her life to upholding the law, to ensuring that justice was served within the confines of the system. But for the first time, she questioned whether sitting behind this bench was truly the best way to protect those who needed it most. Morgan Freeman had won his case, but it should never have been a battle in the first place. The law, as it stood, had allowed Titan Studios to exploit legal loopholes, to manipulate contracts, to strip artists of their fundamental rights without consequence. Her role as a judge had always been to interpret and enforce the law. But what if the law itself was flawed? What if true justice required more than just ruling on cases? It required changing the system from the outside. Thornwald exhaled, running her fingers along the edge of her gavel, the symbol of authority that had once felt powerful but now felt limiting. In the courtroom, she could only rule on what was brought before her, but outside these walls, she could fight for change before these cases ever reached trial. She thought of the young artists, the actors, the musicians who signed contracts they didn't fully understand, trusting that the industry would be fair. Freeman had fought back because he had the knowledge and the means. But what about those who didn't? What about those who lost before they even realized they were in a battle? She had spent her life enforcing the law. Now it was time to rewrite it. The decision settled within her like a quiet certainty. She reached for her robe, folding it neatly over her arm, stepping down from the bench. She walked toward the door, not as a judge bound by the past, but as a woman, stepping into a new fight, one where she could truly protect those who needed her most. Titan Studios had once been an unstoppable force in Hollywood, a powerhouse that dictated industry standards and wielded its influence over performers with airtight contracts and an army of corporate attorneys. But the moment the gavel fell in favor of Morgan Freeman, their empire began to crumble. Within hours, news of their defeat spread like wildfire. Investors panicked, and by the next morning, Titan's stock had plummeted nearly 40%. Major studios that had once partnered with them suddenly distanced themselves, quietly pulling out of future projects and terminating licensing deals. Streaming giants, fearing public backlash, froze negotiations, delaying or outright canceling Titan's upcoming releases. Their once loyal business allies, agencies, distributors, and production houses turned their backs, unwilling to be associated with a company now synonymous with corporate deception. But the most devastating blow came from within. The board of directors, desperate to salvage what remained, demanded resignations. One by one, the top executives, including the very CEO who orchestrated the scheme to claim ownership of Freeman's voice, were forced to step down. Titan's legal team, once feared for its ability to exploit loopholes, was now scrambling to defend against mounting lawsuits from other artists who realized they too had been manipulated. As internal investigations revealed just how deeply embedded the company had been in unethical practices, the fallout extended beyond Wall Street and Hollywood. Government regulators and entertainment unions called for stricter protections for performers, ensuring that what Titan had attempted would never happen again. The company, once arrogant in its control, now faced an uncertain future, hemorrhaging money, credibility, and talent. In the span of just a few weeks, Titan Studios had gone from an industry giant to a cautionary tale, a reminder that no corporation, no matter how powerful, could outrun justice forever. The Freeman ruling sent shockwaves through Hollywood, forcing studios, streaming platforms, and talent agencies to confront a reality they had long ignored. The era of unchecked control over an artist's voice, likeness, and intellectual property was over. Within weeks of the verdict, entertainment unions, legal watchdogs, and advocacy groups pushed for immediate changes, demanding new protections that would prevent future cases like Freeman's. Studios, fearing both legal and public backlash, began revising their contracts. The vague, open-ended clauses that once granted them perpetual rights to an actor's performance were now liabilities, and legal teams scrambled to rewrite agreements to ensure explicit consent for AI-generated voice replication, adaptations, and future uses of recorded material, talent agencies, once complacent in allowing these predatory contracts to persist, became more aggressive in their negotiations, pushing back on vague legal jargon and demanding fair compensation structures. Even technology firms, many of which had quietly been developing AI-driven voice replication tools, were now under scrutiny, no longer able to experiment with synthesized performances without direct legal and ethical oversight. The ruling didn't just protect high-profile actors like Freeman, it set a precedent that extended across the industry, giving lesser-known performers the legal ground to challenge exploitative deals that had previously gone uncontested. Streaming platforms, realizing the shifting landscape, announced new transparency policies regarding licensing agreements, ensuring that performers retained control over how their work was used in the digital age. The industry had learned a painful lesson. What Titan Studios had attempted was no longer just a matter of business strategy, it was a legal and ethical landmine, and any studio that failed to adapt risked becoming the next cautionary tale. In the wake of Freeman's fight, Hollywood was forced to change, not because it wanted to, but because it had no other choice. After his courtroom victory, Morgan Freeman could have easily stepped back into his career, reclaiming his place as one of Hollywood's most revered actors. But winning the case was never just about reclaiming his voice. It was about ensuring no other artist would have to fight the same battle. Instead of simply returning to film sets, he took on a new role. A guardian of performer rights, he partnered with Screen Actors Guild, SAG-AFTRA, and several advocacy organizations, using his influence to push for stronger legal protections against the unethical use of actors' voices and likenesses. His name, once associated primarily with cinematic brilliance, was now also synonymous with legal reform. He spoke at industry conferences, testifying before legislative committees to advocate for new laws that would prevent studios from exploiting performers through deceptive contracts. He lobbied for mandatory transparency clauses, ensuring that no actor, whether an A-list star or an aspiring newcomer, would unknowingly sign away their creative identity. But his activism wasn't just confined to legal reform. He established the Freeman Foundation for Artistic Integrity, an organization dedicated to educating performers about contract law and financial literacy, providing free legal consultations to artists facing unfair treatment, young actors, musicians, and voice performers who once signed deals without fully understanding their rights now had an ally, a man who had fought and won against an industry giant. Yet, despite his growing presence as an activist, Freeman never abandoned his craft. He returned to the screen, his voice more powerful than ever, not just because of its legendary resonance, but because now it belonged to him, and only him. His battle had changed Hollywood. But more importantly, it had empowered an entire generation of artists to take control of their own futures. Beatrix Thornwald had spent her entire career upholding the law from behind the bench, delivering rulings with sharp precision, believing that justice was best served within the boundaries of the courtroom. But Morgan Freeman had shown her something she hadn't allowed herself to see before, that sometimes the law itself needed an advocate beyond the confines of a judge's robe. So when Freeman approached her with an offer to join his newly formed Freeman Foundation for Artistic Integrity as a legal advisor, she didn't dismiss it as she might have once. She listened, and for the first time in years, she felt something she hadn't expected: purpose beyond the bench. "You understand the system," Freeman had said when they met in a quiet office overlooking the city. "But more importantly, you understand its flaws. You've spent decades enforcing the law, now help me change it." It was a bold proposition. But Thornwald had never been one to shy away from a challenge. She had seen firsthand how the industry manipulated contracts, how the legal system, despite its intentions, often failed to protect those who didn't have the power or knowledge to protect themselves. Joining Freeman's initiative meant more than just consulting on cases. It meant rewriting the rules before corporations could exploit them. It meant educating young performers about their rights, helping draft new industry standards, and fighting in legislative halls instead of courtrooms. Accepting the position would be the greatest shift of her career. But as she looked at Freeman, the man she had once doubted but now deeply respected, she realized that this, perhaps, was the work she was meant to do. "I'm in," she said, extending her hand. And as Freeman shook it, Both of them knew this was the beginning of something bigger than any single case. It was the start of real, lasting change. As the sun set over the city, Morgan Freeman sat alone in his quiet study, the weight of the past months settling around him like a story finally reaching its last chapter. The trial was over, the battle won, but victory felt different than he had imagined. It wasn't about headlines, about the applause in the courtroom, or even about Titan Studios collapsing under the weight of its own deception. It was about something far greater. He had spent his life telling stories, lending his voice to history, to fiction, to the deepest truths of the human experience, but this time, the story he told was his own. And it had rewritten the rules of an entire industry. He glanced at the stack of legal documents beside him, contracts that had once sought to own him, now rendered meaningless. The ruling had not just restored his rights, it had set a precedent. Future performers would walk into negotiations with knowledge and protection, studios would think twice before slipping deceptive clauses into contracts, and the very fabric of Hollywood's power dynamics had shifted, he exhaled slowly, knowing that the fight for justice never truly ended. The Freeman Foundation was already growing, with Beatrix Thornwald by his side. Their mission had become clearer: to ensure that no artist would ever have to stand alone against a system built to silence them. He had won not just for himself, but for every creator who came after him. As he leaned back in his chair, watching the city lights flicker to life, he allowed himself a small, quiet smile. This wasn't just the end of a battle, it was the beginning of a legacy. And perhaps in the grand scheme of things, that was the greatest victory of all. The story of Morgan Freeman's legal battle against Titan Studios is more than just a courtroom drama. It is a testament to the values of perseverance, integrity, and the importance of standing up for what is right. These lessons are not limited to the entertainment industry, but resonate deeply in every aspect of life, particularly for those who have spent a lifetime witnessing how power, influence, and deception can often overshadow fairness. For older generations who have seen the world evolve through different struggles, civil rights movements, labor disputes, and personal battles for dignity, Freeman's journey serves as a powerful reminder that no one is ever too old to fight for justice, nor is any battle too great if fought with knowledge and conviction. One of the most important lessons from this case is that knowledge is power. Freeman did not win simply because he was famous or because he had the resources to fight back. He won because he took the time to understand the law, dissect the system, and use its own rules against those who sought to exploit him. This is a lesson that applies to all of us, no matter our age, whether dealing with contracts, financial decisions, or even healthcare rights. Being informed is the greatest defense against those who would take advantage of our trust. Many older adults have faced situations where they were pressured into unfair deals, manipulated by complex legal terms, or made to feel powerless in the face of bureaucracy. But Freeman's story proves that understanding one's rights, even later in life, can turn the tide in any battle. Another crucial takeaway is the importance of dignity and self-worth. Titan Studios attempted to reduce Freeman, his voice, his legacy, his very essence, to a mere asset that could be owned and repurposed without his consent. In many ways, this mirrors the experience of aging in a world that often disregards the wisdom, talents, and contributions of older individuals. Society tends to focus on youth, productivity, and technological advancement, sometimes forgetting that those who have lived through decades of change carry the deepest reservoirs of knowledge and strength. Freeman's refusal to accept this fate sends a powerful message. We are not defined by what others decide for us. We define ourselves. Additionally, this case highlights the evolving nature of justice and the need for change. Judge Beatrix Thornwald, initially skeptical of Freeman's ability to defend himself, had spent her life enforcing the law as it was written, but through this case, she realized that sometimes the law must evolve to truly serve the people. This is a lesson that applies not just to the legal system, but to life itself. Many older adults have experienced moments where they were told that things have always been this way, or that change is impossible. Yet history has shown that every meaningful reform, whether in civil rights, workers' protections, or social justice, was driven by those who refused to accept outdated systems. Freeman's victory was not just personal, it set a precedent that would protect future generations of performers. proving that standing up for what is right can create lasting change, even in industries resistant to accountability. Lastly, Freeman's story is a reminder that battles are not fought alone. Though he represented himself in court, he was surrounded by supporters, legal experts, and industry professionals who believed in his cause. As we grow older, it is easy to feel isolated in our struggles, whether they are legal, medical, or social, but his victory emphasizes that seeking allies, building a community, and standing together can turn even the most daunting battles into winnable fights. Whether it's advocating for fair treatment in the workplace, fighting against unjust policies, or simply ensuring that we are not overlooked in our later years, unity and shared purpose make all the difference. In the end, Freeman's journey is a lesson in resilience, intelligence, and the refusal to be silenced no matter one's age, circumstances, or the power of the opposition. The ability to fight for what is right, armed with knowledge, dignity, and perseverance, is what truly defines victory. For older generations, his story is a powerful affirmation that wisdom and experience remain some of the greatest strengths a person can have, and that justice, though sometimes slow, is always worth pursuing.